Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. A.J. Jacobs is a journalist, author, and lecturer who sees his life as a series of experiments in which he immerses himself in a project or lifestyle and then writes about what he learned. In his book, The Know-It-All, One Man's Humble Quest to Become the Smartest Person in the World, he wrote about the 18 months he spent reading all 32 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica in a quest to learn everything in the world. In his next book, The Year of Living Biblically, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Bible as Literally as Possible, A.J. writes about his experiment to live for 1 year according to all the moral codes expressed in the Bible. And I can attest that he did it. And his latest book, which we'll talk about today, published earlier this month, and we are talking in May 2024, is called The Year of Living Constitutionally, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Constitution's Original Meaning. Welcome to the broadcast, AJ. Full disclosure, we're kind of friends.
We are. Thank you for saying so.
And you were so nice to write the preface for my last book, My Jewish Year, which...
It was an honor.
I was
indebted. Delighted.
So that's the nepotism. We've gotten it out of the way. Is that in the Constitution?
They did not like nepotism back then.
They did not. Well, you can talk about that.
But they liked friends.
They
I don't think
friends,
we're actually...
Right.
Well, I did write a book about how all people on earth are related.
Are connected.
And especially Jewish people, Ashkenazi Jewish people, are probably seventh cousins on average.
We're all one family.
There you go.
Which is a little disturbing and also moving at the same time.
Exactly.
But let's talk about the Constitution and your decision to live by it. What actually made you turn to this immersion experience?
Well, as you know, I like the immersion. I'm honored to write a foreword to My Jewish Year.
Thank you.
As you mentioned, I wrote one about the Bible, where I tried to follow all the rules of the Bible. The 10 Commandments, but also not wearing two kinds of fabric, growing the beard. So I love to immerse myself, and I always knew that the Constitution could be a sort of sequel to the Year of Living Biblically, because a lot of the same topics come up, the themes, such as how literally should we interpret this text and how much should it evolve, which is all about the Talmud and rabbinical interpretation. And in this case, it's the Supreme Court. How do they interpret it? So I always thought this would be interesting. And then a couple of years ago, it seemed to me to become super timely, because you have now a Supreme Court with a majority who subscribe to originalism, which is the idea that the most important thing is what those words meant.
And to adhere to them as strictly as possible.
Exactly. And that was the Dobbs abortion decision and the Bruin about guns. Those were originalist decisions. So I said, I'm going to become the ultimate originalist. I'm going to not pick and choose, just go full in, and I'm going to try to understand the Constitution by following that original meaning, which meant using the mindset and the tools from the 18th century. It meant walking around the Upper West Side with my 18th century musket.
I want to ask you about that. I can't imagine the reception.
It was a mixed reception.
It meant using a quill. You only wrote...
I wrote with a quill, which was actually one of the most wonderful parts of it. And I quartered soldiers. I provided quarters for soldiers. And it was a fascinating year. And it was partly a crash course in the Constitution, because I, like most Americans, 60% of Americans...
had never read the whole thing.
Never? You haven't?
I actually have.
Oh,
but
nice.
Partly because I had a journalism teacher, Fred W. Friendly, who carried it around and
he's one
insisted that we all read it. But
and
that's not wearing a badge of honor. It just happened to be that I had a professor who insisted upon it, because he said exactly what you do, that so many of us don't actually know what the words...
Right.
What words are there. I want to point out, before we go to some of the examples, that you also relied on quite a number of constitutional scholars for your interviews. Can you just give us a sense of how did you identify them, and how come they said yes?
It's a good I was very lucky. I had a great board of constitutional advisors, and Lawrence Tribe from Harvard gave it a wonderful blurb, but I had all sorts of others. And I also tried to choose them from all over the political spectrum. So I had the progressives, I had the sort of the moderate liberals like Professor Tribe, but then I had some hardcore. I think it's very important, especially now, to what is called steel manning. You know that phrase? The opposite of straw manning. So when you describe the other side, you do it in the strongest possible way.
That's very Talmudic.
It is very Talmudic. There you go. And I do have some good Jewish content for us.
You're prepared.
I am prepared.
Well, you are a Jew, so you belong on JBS. But we can get to that. Let's just talk before we go to some of the really big questions. Some of the fun stuff that really struck me, which is kind of how you changed your life. And part of it is just your schedule, like when you woke up, when you went to sleep, whether you used actual like electrical devices, lights.
A lot of candlelight.
Can you tell us a little bit about living by candlelight?
Well, I was, one thing, it is lovely. I love the flickering. My wife, originally I had beef tallow candles. Not sure they're kosher, but they certainly did not smell good. They
literally are made of the animal
fat, yes.
Okay.
But so I had to switch to beeswax candles. But I will say, writing with a quill was one of the great joys because I think it changed the way I thought, because I was not tempted by the dings and chimes of the internet.
And the surfing, and like when you're reading one thing, you could be reading another thing.
Exactly. And I do think it made me a more nuanced thinker. And I don't think everyone needs to take up the quill, even though I love it, and I loved carving my own. But just writing, even writing by hand, or just cutting your internet off while you're thinking and writing, so important. You
said at one point that it actually slowed your thinking so that maybe you were thinking more clearly.
Yeah, I do believe that. And I feel that a lot of the time we're in reaction mode. We've got this fire hose of negative information 16 hours a day, and we have no time to really digest it. Back then, Ben Franklin's newspaper came out twice a week. So I was trying to follow that rhythm of twice a week. I don't think you have to go that far, but really reading the news maybe once a day for half an hour, and then the rest of the time thinking of solutions and debating, that is a much healthier way to go through life.
You mentioned the originalists, and the opposite is the living constitutionalists,
right?
Am I correct? So right now we're really seeing that play out in high relief. And you mentioned Dobbs, for instance, but just again for people to understand, why are both intellectually honest? You know what I'm saying? Like those who actually fully believe in one point of view.
Right, right.
What are they holding on to in terms of?
I think the steel manning of originalism is basically, they were very upset that the justices in the 60s were making these civil rights decisions that I happen to agree with, but it was these 9 unelected people with amazing power over how we live our lives. So originally, originalism was meant to constrain judges and say, just follow the text. And so the idea is, the Constitution is like a contract. You hire a contractor to redo the bathroom and put in a new bathtub, and you don't want the contractor to say, oh, I also decided to install a sofa and a chandelier because I decided that would be good. On the other hand, living constitutionalism says, this is a 230-year-old document written by 55 white men, some of them slave owners.
Why are we listening?
Well, they say we do have to look at the big principles, which are equality, liberty, equal protection. These things are almost timeless. But
the world has changed.
But the world has changed, so applications have changed. And just to give you one example of how stark this can be, you have the 14th Amendment, which talked about equal protection and due process. This was after the Civil War. And if you are a full-on originalist like Clarence Thomas, you think it should only apply to what the words meant then. And equal protection then those people were not thinking about women's rights or gay rights or trans rights. They were thinking about, it was mostly geared towards black men who they feared would be the subject of racism from the southern states. So Clarence Thomas says, no, the 14th Amendment does not constitutionally protect women or gay people. So he has indicated he would roll back gay marriage as a constitutional right. So it has real consequences of how you the way you choose to interpret, it's not an abstract thing. It has big consequences on how we live our lives.
Well, free speech is another example, and you talk about how it really has changed in terms of understanding what the Constitution meant when they talked about it. Can you give us a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, this was fascinating because I'm a fan of free speech. I'm a journalist, but I realize I'm a fan of 20th and 21st century free speech, not the founders' free speech. They had a much more constrained version of free speech. Which was? Well, it wasn't quite Stalinist Russia, but it was
close.
Well, I wouldn't say close, but it was maybe 10%. I mean, they thought that you could say whatever you want, but the government also had the right to punish you because it was all about the common good. So, for instance, states had blasphemy laws. States had laws against cursing. In New York State, in 1789, you'd have to pay 37.5 cents every time you said the S word or the F word. I tried that since I was living.
Yeah, you tried not to blaspheme.
I try not to blaspheme.
How did that go?
I did okay with the blaspheming. It was the cursing that's a little more difficult. And I fined my sons 37.5 cents. They were very legalistic. Oh, I don't have a half cent, so I can't do it. But the point, I guess the point of the project in that sense was...
It makes you conscious.
Yeah, that this is... So do we want to go back to that time? Not necessarily. I don't think progressives would like it, but conservatives wouldn't either, because the whole argument that Citizens United, that the First Amendment covers the political donations, the founders would say, well, are you insane? That's not true. They were very concerned about corruption in politics. They would not have gone for this interpretation of the First Amendment. And that's according to many historians that I talked to.
I also loved what, it is called the power to petition, am I right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
And you were very pro-petition.
Right.
As it turns out, and you even started one of your own.
I did.
It's very enterprising.
Thank you.
Can you just tell us about your proposal? Because it actually made some sense to me, even though it's probably sacrilege at this point, which is the idea that there shouldn't just be one president.
Well, that's it. I love reading about the Constitutional Convention, because you realize it was so fluid. There were so many ideas. In an alternate universe, we could have a very different America. And one of the ideas, when one of the delegates said, well, maybe we should have a single president, several of the other delegates said, are you jesting? That's a terrible idea. We just fought a bloody war to get rid of a monarch, and now you want to install an elected monarch? This is terrible. So they said, at the very least, we'll have 3 presidents, 3 co-presidents, like a triumvirate, or maybe... Simultaneous. Or 12. Ben Franklin mentioned a council of 12 presidents. And so I thought this was interesting. I thought it's an interesting idea. Realistically, having Biden, Trump, and RFK Jr. co-working in the Oval Office
sounds like a disaster.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I actually want 3 presidents, but I wanted to bring up the idea that the president, his power, and it is a him, has become out of control. I mean, the founders would be appalled by the war powers, the trade powers, all the powers the president has. Congress was supposed to be the dominant part of government.
And so before we leave that, I want to just drill down a little bit on what the fear was, what the founders were trying to stave off, that they had lived through with great trauma. We sort of forget what it's like to have a despot or to have a monarch or to be under the thumb of a king. So tell us a little bit more about what their anxiety was.
Terrified of monarchy, authoritarianism, anything having to do with aristocracy, and they tried to put in these constraints on the president, which have not worked. But when reading the news in the last month and this idea of the criminal immunity of the president, I mean, I cannot imagine the founders, what they would have been appalled.
Why?
Well, because that's exactly the opposite of what they wanted. They wanted to set up a government where everyone was equal under the law from the top to the bottom. And the opposite of monarchy, where one person is often considered above the law. So yeah, this would shock them, and it terrifies me, this sort of this long And it's not just Trump, it's been going on for decades. I think Trump, if he wins, will accelerate it in a very scary way. But we have been going towards this one person having more and more power, and it's not healthy.
In your last answer, you said in an alternate universe, we could have a very different America. You were talking about the Constitutional Convention and the robust debate, disputation that was healthy,
right,
and wasn't eviscerating and mean and cruel and kind of flame-throwing. And it's just, reading your book, I just had such kind of wistfulness, nostalgia for something I never actually lived through. But just to think about what that would be if these arguments were really kind of authentic and not grandstanding or, you know, in some say virtue signaling or whatever we want to, whatever, you pick your disparaging word. It feels like it's not coming from a true place of intellectual belief.
I love that you say that. Yeah, that was one of the, and I don't want to return to the 18th century.
On both sides of the aisle, I would say, on both sides of the aisle.
Right, it's very rigid. And I think one of the virtues, as I say, we don't, it was a racist, sexist, homophobic time. We don't want to return to it. But one of the virtues that we should not underestimate is that these founders were much more thoughtful and open-minded in their arguments. And so changing your mind was not seen as shameful flip-flopping. It was a virtue. And Ben Franklin at the convention said, the older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinions, which I love.
Amazing.
And he also told a wonderful story. He loved the jests. So he told a little story about a French lady at the convention. He said, there was this French lady who said to her sister, I don't understand it. Why is it that I am the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue? And his point was, we're all the French lady. We all think we're correct, and we're not. So he knew about our biases before Daniel Kahneman, and he was very interested in changing minds.
Can you just tell the anecdote about Madison's deathbed?
Oh, I do love this. This is another example of the very last act of James Madison, father of the Constitution, on planet Earth was he changed his mind. He was on his deathbed. His niece was there. He made a strange face. She said, Uncle, are you okay? He said, oh, yes, I'm fine. Nothing more than a change of mind. And then he died. So we don't know, did he change his mind about the bicameral legislature? Did he change his mind about the wallpaper? We don't know. But the point is, he changed his mind right up till the end. And we need to recapture some of that humility and flexibility.
You said you brought some Jewish threads of the Constitution.
I did.
just want to give you a chance.
Well, first of all, we've been talking about originalism, which is trying to figure out what did the Constitution mean at the time, which I do think is part of the way we should interpret the Constitution. But you also have to look at other things like the consequences and the reputation of the Supreme Court. But originalism is very focused on that original meaning, and that is a very un-Jewish way of interpreting the text, because I've talked to several Jewish constitutional scholars who say, you don't do that with the Torah. You don't even try to get into the mind of God, because that is hubris. So it's more about the wrestling and the evolving of the meaning. So I do think, living constitutionalism is a much more Jewish approach to a text. I also I spent some time at Shirith Israel, which is the oldest existing congregation
in New York.
I think in America.
Probably right.
Because there is one in Rhode Island, but they have the oldest building, I believe, but the oldest congregation and they were fascinating. They told me about how a lot of synagogues, after the Constitution was written, created their own constitutions. And so it was sort of, they wanted to be more democratic. And I also loved that Shirith Israel was going on during the reign of King George III. And they used to say a prayer every weekend in honor of King George III, and people would stand up.
Wow.
Then, when the revolution came and we had this new government, they said a prayer to the president, but they made a very conscious choice to sit down during the prayer, because the president is not divine. The president does not deserve to be I mean, he deserves our respect, but we should not be standing up.
Wow, that's amazing. You do talk about this chair that was it Ben Franklin, or did George Washington sit in?
George Washington was sitting in the chair. And
so tell us about that.
I love this because I think it's the perfect way sort of to open the book. Was this chair at the Constitutional Convention? It was wood, and it had a wooden carving on the back, and it was of the sun. But it wasn't of the whole sun. You could just see the half the sun. The other half was below the horizon. But you couldn't tell, was this a rising sun or a setting sun? Because it was just stationary as their. And Ben Franklin, at the end of the convention, when against all odds they had created this Constitution, he said, then at that point I finally knew it was a rising sun. The sun is rising on America. So at the start of the book, that was one of my questions. Is the sun still rising on America? Because you read the news and it's just this avalanche of negativity. And my conclusion, I mean, not to do spoilers, there's lots more in the book. So
no, it's a great read.
Thank you.
Great read.
But one of them is that you should, the sun is not rising or setting based on natural laws. It's up to us. We are the ones who can save democracy or not. And we have to roll up our sleeves, and it's going to be hard work, and we have to make reforms. And one of my favorite parts of the book is, this is a very small step forward, but it's a concrete one. I read that in the 18th century, there was a tradition of election cakes, because elections were seen as, at least for the privileged few who could vote, they were festive. It was like
a celebration.
Celebration. There was music. It wasn't quite Coachella or Burning Man, but there was music, parades, there was rum, and election cakes. People would bake these sometimes huge 70-pound election.
Like as big as a person.
As big as a person. And everyone would eat and celebrate. And I thought we need to recapture some of that joy in democracy to remind ourselves democracy is sweet. That was sort of the catchphrase. So I got hundreds of people around the country to bake election cakes last November, bring them to the polls, and try to instill.
And what do they take pictures and send them to you?
Yeah,
like, what was the proof of cake?
It was. Well, I did it on Facebook, which I know is not very 18th century, but it is.
But it's a little antiquated.
That's right. That's what I thought. It's sort of an older platform. It's closer to the founders than, say, Snapchat.
And so people sent in their cakes from where? Atlanta, from.
Right. There was peach cakes from Georgia, and the original recipe contains cloves, so not everyone loves that. Oh. So everyone did their own individual.
So you mean
cake.
There was a standard cake?
There was a standard recipe.
Wow. For
cloves,
election.
figs, and yeah. But I didn't enforce that. And I am doing it again in November, and because I got so much positive feedback. And for me, it was very emotional because it's been such a negative, and just a really oppressive time. And
before we leave the negativity, I mean, I love the whole celebration piece, but
of course.
I just want to get to what is somewhat of a groundswell, which is kind of a narrative of America as sinful in some way, or obviously slavery is a huge blot on our past. And I'm not diminishing that. But there is some sense that I think what you and I didn't have growing up of, like, maybe the whole enterprise was flawed.
Right.
And so you ask a question in the book that I just would love you to maybe to end with. Well, I want to get to the pursuit of happiness. So the penultimate question. You say, is it a document of liberation or oppression?
Right.
How do you answer that after this journey?
Well, I think it can be. The Constitution, like most things, is not just one thing. It contains multitudes. And one of the stories I love is that you had, before the Civil War, you had some abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, said the Constitution is a pact with the devil because it did condone slavery, and it should be destroyed. It should be burned. He would literally burn the Constitution on stage in front of hundreds of people. He was a showman.
Wow.
Originally, Frederick Douglass agreed with him, you know, the great former enslaved man, become orator, and he originally agreed that this was a pact with the devil. But then, sometime in the 1850s, he changed. He changed his mind, which we talked about is a good thing, and he said, you know what, it's more constructive, more productive to reframe that and say, no, the Constitution is better seen as a promissory note. It contains these wonderful ideas of liberty and equality, but America is not living up to them. Let's make America, let's struggle to make America live up to the ideals that are in the Constitution. And to me, that is so much more inspiring. Don't throw America out, just work to make it better and live up to its wonderful ideals.
Wonderful. So let's end with happiness, the pursuit of happiness, which also it was very focusing in your book. We totally misinterpret, I think, today, which is a sense of like, I should be happy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
That's not what it's about.
No,
so tell us what it is about.
And a lot of this comes from our mutual friend, Jeffrey Rosen, who wrote a book called The Pursuit of Happiness.
Who heads the Constitutional Center.
Exactly,
in
National
Washington.
Constitutional Center. And his argument, which I think is right, is that they were, when they talked about happiness, they didn't talk about feeling good, they talked about doing good. So the way to be happy is actually to be a part of this community, to help others. There's a huge sense of self-sacrifice for the community. And whether that was being on the bucket brigade and helping to put out fires as an amateur firefighter, or being part of the militia, every adult male had to be part of the militia, which I'm not ready to go back to. I don't want to go back, but I do love the idea of thinking of someone besides yourself, looking at the greater picture, the greater good. Maybe that means a month of national service, everyone does AmeriCorps. I don't know how, what is the concrete solution, but I do think we need to get back to that mindset that it's not all about us, it's about the greater good. And ironic or paradoxically, when you think of others' happiness, you become happier yourself.
The book is The Year of Living Constitutionally, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Constitution's Original Meaning. A.J. Jacobs, thank you for this wonderful book, and it's great to be with you.
Thank you, Abby.
And the book is available everywhere. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight, and I will see you next time.